Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm joined by Dr. Suzana Herculano-Houzel. She is Associate Professor of Psychology and Biological Sciences and Associate Director for Communications at the Vanderbilt Brain Institute at Vanderbilt University. She is interested in comparative neuroanatomy, cellular composition of brains, brain morphology, brain evolution, metabolic cost of body and brain, sleep requirement across species, feeding time, among other topics, and she's the author of The Human Advantage, a new understanding of how our brain became remarkable. And today we're going to focus on that book and also on her chapter in a new edited book celebrating the 150th anniversary of Darwin's Descent of Man. And the book is titled The Most Interesting Problem, What Darwin's Descent of Man Got Right and Wrong About Human Evolution. So, Dr. Herculano-Houzel, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure. It's a
My
pleasure to
pleasure.
everyone. Yeah.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me here.
Okay, great. So let's start with this. What is the best way to understand how our brains evolved? Because it seems that there are different theories out there. For example, I know that until a few decades ago, I think one theory that was very prevalent was the triune brain model. I think we can call it that. But nowadays it is disputed. So could you tell us about that?
Sure. To me, one of the greatest things about science is that it too evolves. It changes over time as we learn new facts, and you discover new facts, and sometimes it gets you to the point where you have to look back and reinterpret the story that you had been putting together so far, right? And the story of human evolution in recent years, in the last 4 decades or so, has been very much a story of human exceptionality, of making the point, or trying to make the point, that humans are special, humans are outliers, humans are an exception to the rules, which is really curious because that's not at all how Darwin got this story started. In the Descent of Man, he makes a very clear point of saying humans should really be just considered one more primate species. We're with what limited evidence he had available back then, he was already making the parallels between how all of these features that we humans have, they are very much similar to features that other primates do, including emotions. That was a big thing for Darwin himself. So that is, I think, in a nutshell, that is the story that I was able to pick up on once we had new data, new facts, which in the form of new numbers on how many neurons make up the brains of different species, including humans, and we could tell a fresh version of that story that didn't need to take into account or to build on any of the previous assumptions that you had out there. Mm-hmm. So yeah, when you talk about this idea of a triune brain, that's actually the embodiment of this 19th century idea that evolution was progress, embraced actually by Darwin himself. Although that part has fallen by the wayside, but he very much proposed that that evolution was improvement through adaptation by means of natural selection. And well, there's a whole other story there, but the important part for now is that Darwin did have this idea that brains improved through evolution. And that was an idea that was present also in the very early days of brain anatomy. that if you compare mammalian brains to bird and to reptile brains, mammalian brains would be an improvement over reptilian brains, right? And an improvement also that would also be visible in the form of layers, in the very same way that you see geological layers, which was actually an understanding that was crucial to the beginnings of to the very discovery of evolution, right? That you have progressive layers on the soil, each of them with a very different type of record of once living beings. So exactly in parallel with that idea was this initial notion in brain anatomy and evolution that also the mammalian brain would have kept a record of its evolutionary past, and that would be in the form of this lower reptilian brain on top of which you would have new layers, and then finally what supposedly distinguishes us, which is the cortex. And of course, that cortex would be the most evolved, the most developed in the human species. But it turns out that's not true in oh so many ways. First, evolution is not progress. Second, reptiles do have a cortex, just like we do. So actually, you will not find that mammals have more structures in their brains on top of what reptiles have. No, all vertebrates have the same parts of the brain. They're all there. They're just expanded to different degrees. And even better, then you also add to the reasons why that story is not true, the triune brain story is not true, is that we're not descended from reptiles. We're cousins. So it's exactly like cousins coexist in time and share a common ancestor, which is your grandparents. Mammals and reptiles are these cousins that share a common ancestor about 300 million years ago. So it's absolutely not the case that we develop on top of them or our brain developed on top of their brain. We're just cousins with brains that are different versions of the same thing.
Right. But is our brain what we would expect of a typical primate?
It actually is. So that's something that we found out through looking at the numbers, the actual numbers of neurons and the numbers of glial cells that compose the human brain as a whole, and even the different parts of the brain, and even if we look at the human cerebral cortex in relation and compare it to other parts of the brain. So the old version of the story of human brain evolution had it that the human cerebral cortex was extraordinarily expanded. It had become extraordinarily large, right? And it is true that if you look in terms of size, the cortex is this part of the brain that sits on top of everything else, and it is expanded to different degrees in different species, and it is true that it is in proportional terms to the rest of the brain. The human cortex is about 83% of the entire volume of the brain, which is pretty remarkable. But then again, to be fair, you have to look at other species, and you see that a horse has a cerebral cortex that's about 80% of its brain too. So we're not all that different, right? I mean, surely what separates us humans and what we can do from other species cannot be just that 1%, 1 percentual point of difference between to the next species. So it turns out that if you look at, if you disregard size, and that is that's a very important thing to disregard. First, because it's very it's what stares you in the face when you look at brains, right? The first thing that you notice is that there exist brains that are this big, and then there are elephant brains which are this size. By the way, 3 times the size of a human brain. So we also don't have the largest brain around. But it turns out that if you just put side aside for a second and focus on the new numbers that we had, which is how many neurons different brains are made of and different cerebral cortices are made of, which I believe is, for now, the most significant variable that we have to infer anything about cognitive capabilities, because we know at this point, thanks to the work of a number of other researchers, that even if you compare reptiles to birds to mammals, the connectivity, so the major setup of the brain is very similar. Not only in what parts of the brain do you recognize, what are the main structures, but also how they are connected, right? So if that's the case, then it seems pretty logical that, all else being the same, then a key variable to cognitive power should simply be how many neurons do you have to do that job, right? So focus on the cerebral cortex and you realize that there's a certain number of neurons that is enormously variable across species. But if you look at the human brain, so at the same time, yes, we do stand out from all other species in that we are the species that has the most neurons in the cerebral cortex, which I would expect, of course, to make us the species with the most cognitive power, with the most information processing power. But if you look at the relationships between the size of the brain and the number of neurons in the cerebral cortex, or the number of neurons in the cortex compared to the number of neurons in the cerebellum or other parts of the brain, we are a species that falls right on the line along with any other primate species. Except where body size comes into the picture. And there is where I would argue that if we got it the other way around, it's gorillas and orangutans that are outliers, points off the curve, because they have brains that are actually fairly small for the size of the body that they have.
But are there areas of the brain where we have an unusual big number of neurons compared to other species?
Unusual in the sense that it deviates from the expectation for a generic primate brain? No.
Right.
So even prefrontal cortex, when you look at just the most anterior parts of the brain, which are really important for cognition, because the way I like to think of the cerebral cortex as a whole is it's this part of the brain that sits on top of everything else and literally gets a copy of everything else that's going on in the brain, right? Which is what allows the cortex to create something new, to put all those signals, all that information together, find new associations, recognize patterns, and that's what allows behavior to become flexible and complex. Now, within the cortex itself, there is a part, the very front part, the prefrontal cortex, that is extraordinarily good at doing just that, because within the cortex, that is the part that receives, it's the same dynamic, it receives copies of what goes on in all the other parts of the cortex itself. So that is your main associator, let's say, within the cortex. And so one way of defining that part of cortex is also by exclusion. It's the part of your cortex that is not sensory and also not motor. It's not doing anything directly related to your body. What it does is orchestrate all all the complexity really that comes from creating new associations that allows you to put two and two together and remember what is it that usually happens when you are in this kind of environment, and then learn from your past and make predictions about your future based on what you learned and create new associations. That's where creativity comes from in a big way. So there has been the idea that the prefrontal cortex of the human brain would be particularly well developed or unusually expanded. And this is where choosing your words carefully makes a world of difference, because it is expanded, yes, but it does have the largest number of neurons as far as we can tell, yes. It's just that it's still just as many as you would expect for a generic primate brain the size of ours. So where things really go off kilter with humans in the comparison between humans and other species is when you take the size of the body as a measuring stick. Mm-hmm. So if you compare humans to, say, a gorilla is 2 to 3 times the size of a human. And because we know that across animals as a whole, the bigger the animal is, the bigger the brain is, then you would expect that if we're smaller than a gorilla, then our brain should also be smaller than a gorilla brain. And yet our brain is about 3 times the size of a gorilla brain. So that's the comparison that got this whole idea started, that humans are special, that humans are outliers, that our brains are extraordinarily large. When I think a much better way of telling the same story or actually a much better story that we can tell from the same numbers, from the same facts, is that, it's actually gorillas that should have, you would expect them to have a brain that's 2 or 3 times the size of ours, and yet it's not. And I think there's a very good reason how that happened.
Mm-hmm. And what would be that reason?
It takes energy. It takes lots of energy to support a body of a certain size and also a brain of a certain number of neurons. And this is calculation that we've done. So the starting piece there is that we found that just like a larger body uses more energy to function, to stay alive. So you can say that a larger body legitimately requires more energy to stay alive, simply because if it can't get that energy, it will just fail and die. Right? Mm-hmm. We can also say that the more neurons a brain has, whatever its size, the more energy it uses. Maybe it's because the more energy it gets, or it demands that more energy. We don't know exactly how that part goes yet. That's one of the cool things, by the way, to me about science. The more you find out, the more you realize you don't know, and therefore the more that you need to research and ask. But anyway, so knowing that, then we can actually calculate how much energy a primate the size of the size of our body, or the size of a gorilla, will how much energy they will require, and how much energy a brain of a certain number of neurons will require. And we can also calculate how many hours an animal of a certain size will need to spend eating to get all that energy, because we're not plants. We're animals that need to eat. We need to actively seek out food and ingest that food. And also, very important part, that food has to go into our mouth, and we have to chew it before we can swallow it. You can do this experiment yourself. You can try to swallow food as quickly as you want. It'll just not happen. You can only swallow food after you've chewed it enough that it turns into a wet paste in your mouth, and then you can swallow it. So there are all these limitations to how much energy any animal can get per hour. And when you put all of that together, you realize that gorillas, as they are today, which is very large-bodied creatures that eat 8.5 hours per day. They have pretty much the brain that they could possibly afford, period. And meaning they could not afford any more neurons in the brain than they already have. And we can even estimate that for gorillas to have the number of neurons that you would expect a generic primate to have in their cortex, they would have to spend an extra 1.5 hours eating per day, every single day. Now, imagine your life, what it would be like if you had to spend 10 hours of your waking life, which is already pretty restricted by the about 8 hours that we spend, if not asleep, then lying down, right? Resting or secluded in some way. So that's an enormous time requirement that gorillas certainly don't have. And the fun thing is that if you do the same math for humans, you realize that what we have today, the combination of a smaller body than a gorilla's, but a brain that's 3 times the size of a gorilla's, if we ate like any other primate does, we could not be here. Definitely not spending time to talk about all of this, because we would have to be out there 9.5 hours per day, every single day, looking for food and eating, right? So there's this time constraint associated with the energy needs, with the energy that powers bodies of a certain size and a certain number of neurons, that I think it's not even that we were forgetting to account for. I think we hadn't realized yet that had to be taken into consideration, and that it could turn out to be such an important, fundamental part of human evolution, of the story of human evolution.
Mm-hmm. So our diets were an important factor in the evolution of our brains.
Absolutely. So the key insight for me is not mine. It was Richard Wrangham's, a primatologist at Harvard, who had this insight, sitting in front of his fire, thinking about human and primate evolution, and comparing the shape of the skull of gorillas, and the changes that happened to the skull of our ancestors over time. You see that gorillas have these gigantic bone crests there's the sagittal crest on top of the skull, which is what makes their heads seem so large, right? And bone is what muscles are attached to. And that crest disappeared. We don't have that crest anymore, which is something that plenty of other primates do, but it's specially developed in the largest primates. And that makes sense because those are animals that are spending an enormous amount of their time making huge muscle effort to eat, to chew their food. I mean, just think of, we like exercise, and we know what exercise does to our muscles and to our bones, right? So imagine what would happen to your face if you spent 10 hours per day chewing vigorously. So Richard Wrangham had this really key insight that the only way to explain how those huge bone structures disappear in human evolution is if hours and hours of mastication, of chewing per day, were no longer necessary. And that's where cooking comes in, because cooking is transforming food before you put it in your mouth. And that transformation makes food much easier to digest, much easier to chew, much easier to swallow. So not only you put less effort into into eating and assimilating that energy, transferring that energy to your body, you also do that in less time. And the bonus is that you also get more calories out of that time and energy effort that you're putting in, simply because now that food, cooked food, is easier to softer and easier to process. You can actually chew it down to an absolute pulp in your mouth, and when you ingest it and when it gets to your stomach and your intestines, that the fact that it is a pulp means that every last molecule that you've ingested is exposed to your digestive enzymes. So you can get 100% caloric yield out of whatever it is that you eat, which is drastically different from the maybe 30% that you will get out of eating, say, a raw carrot. If you eat that carrot raw, it's going to be harder to chew. You're going to give up chewing it to a pulp, and you're going to swallow it as soon as you can, by which time it's still going to be pieces of carrot, which means that when it gets to your digestive tract, it's only the surface that's going to get eaten, right? It's so the rest leaves your body as it got in. So you put all of that time, you put in all of that effort, and you only get much less of the much fewer calories. So cooking is enormously transformative. All of a sudden, you have these creatures, our descendants, our ancestors, who still needed the same amount of energy to run their bodies and the number of neurons that they already had in their brains, but now they could get 3 times the amount of energy in even less time, because it takes less effort to chew. So, I mean, just think of how much time we now, modern humans, spend eating per day. And even then, it's still a significant amount of time, right? We probably put it all together, we probably still spend a good hour per day eating. And that's also not taken not into consideration the fact that we no longer have to plant our food or collect our food. I mean, it's nothing more complicated than just going down the street to the nearest grocery store and just collecting. In our case now means just simply taking things off the shelves and putting them in your cart and taking them home, right? Somebody else already took care of all that. So anyway, that's the I think the realization that so Wrangham's realization that there's a certain time requirement for eating, and that cooking is the transformation that changes the picture completely. That was key. So what we did was build on that idea and just ask the question, well, let's try this in numbers. Let's see how transformative this really is, to the point of, well, maybe, so it's one thing to consider that was a bonus, that coming up with ways to transform your food was a bonus that just added a benefit that made things better or easier, right? But it turns out that when you do the math and you discover that without cooking, without any kind of food transformation, we modern humans would simply be not viable, because there are not enough hours in the day for us to exist, for a primate to exist, if it had to eat for 9.5 hours per day. Then you realize that cooking was not a bonus. Cooking was really a transformative piece of our evolutionary history. So I've never looked at my kitchen the same way again. My favorite thing to do right now is to cook on the grill. I literally just toss stuff on the fire, and then you realize that there's a true bonus. cooked food tastes delicious. It's so much better than the raw stuff, right?
Right, right.
Which, by the
So,
way, gorillas will also recognize. Gorillas and orangutans will prefer cooked food to raw food whenever they have a choice. They're even willing to wait to have their food cooked.
yeah,
That's
and I think
that's
that
frankly
also, and
worth
I
it.
think that also our domesticated animals.
Oh, absolutely. If you ever made the mistake of giving your dogs cooked food, you're doomed. They now that they discover that exists, they're never going to accept kibble again.
Yeah. Okay, so another question. I've heard several times people saying that our brains are composed of 100 billion neurons. But is that correct?
No, it's not. And that was actually the very thing that got me started down this rabbit hole. It was actually one step before that. It was this idea, completely wrong and just fantasy, of course, that we only use 10% of the brain. So one way that that could be true was that if it were true, what you will still find in textbooks to this day, that the human brain is made of 100 billion neurons and 10 times as many glial cells. So you do some poor approximated math, and well, maybe that means that if neurons are about 10% of all cells in the brain, maybe it could be true that we only use 10% of the brain cells, which is already not true, because the glial cells are really important, and without them the neurons can't work, even if it remains true that it is the neurons doing the brunt of the computational work of the information processing. But still, that was those were the numbers that people would toss around, right? And I wanted to know where those numbers came from. How do you even figure out how many neurons a brain has? And that was when I realized that we didn't know those numbers. The 100 billion neurons was an estimate of order of magnitude. A good estimate of order of magnitude, mind you, but still not the actual number. Now we know that if we did have 100 billion neurons, then we would indeed be exceptional. That would make us outliers. It's not 100 that we have. On average, it's about 86 billion neurons. Which I have people very frequently point out, oh, 86 billion, 100 billion, what's the difference? It's very much the same. It's like, no, it's not. The difference, the 14 billion neurons that are missing, is a full baboon brain. That's not small change. And well, so the 100 billion was just an order of magnitude estimate, and the 10 times as many glial cells was just plain wrong, as best as we can tell. And a colleague of mine tried to retrace that story. It seems to have played very much like a game of telephone, where a scientific game of telephone, where you read something that applies exclusively to this one part of the brain, and then somebody cites the number that you wrote down, and the story just degenerates, and on the other side it emerges as throughout the brain there are 10 times as many glial cells as there are neurons, which is very obviously not true. So what we find is that in the human brain as a whole, there's about one glial cell for every neuron, which is a very important number, not only because it's clearly not 10 to 1, but the real reason why that number is important is that that proportion is exactly what you would expect to find in any primate brain with the number of neurons that we have.
Is there any correspondence between certain traits of a particular species brain and its cognitive abilities? I mean, for example, is it that species with bigger brains have more cognitive abilities or are more, for example, behaviorally flexible?
So to be fair, we still need much more data on that we can use as measurements of cognitive capability across species. We're essentially getting down here to the question of how do you measure intelligence and how do you compare intelligence or how do you compare capabilities across species, right?
Right.
Which is a very hard thing to do. But to the extent that it has been done, what we can say today is that the best correlate of this cognitive capability across birds and primates is simply how many neurons they have in the cerebral cortex, regardless of size, regardless of the size of the cortex, regardless of the size of the brain, regardless of the size of the body. Which so that is how you get a crow that is capable of not even just using tools. Crows can craft their own tools and can solve problems that require thinking ahead, just like great apes can do. And that's something that at first sight, I completely agree, you would not expect, because one is a crow with a brain this size and the other is a gorilla or a chimpanzee, right, with a brain about this big. But it turns out that's diversity for you. That's how nature works. There isn't a single way of putting brains together. There you can have brains of a similar size be made of completely different numbers of neurons. And so like a chimpanzee has about 6 times as many neurons in the cerebral cortex as a cow, even though the size of their cortices is very much the same. And you can have a bigger brain still have fewer neurons than a smaller brain. That's the case of the elephant cortex compared to the human cortex. The elephant cortex is twice the size of ours, but we have 3 times the number of neurons. So it's that diversity in the makeup of brains that we now know was throwing people off for decades, because for decades the only variable really that was available for all these comparisons, including comparisons of cognitive capabilities, was the size of the brain. And now we know that that really doesn't tell you much about what the brain is made of.
Right. And in terms of the types of cells that compose our brains, is it that we find the same types of cells across all animal species, or they are different between species?
They're very much similar types of cells. So one of the hugest scientific efforts in brain research these days are these single cell studies, where we now have the technology to sample individual cells in the brain and find out what genes are expressed, what genes are used, which essentially translates into what, just like I study how many neurons compose brains of different species, you can use this technology now to study what proteins compose different neurons within the same brain, right?
Right.
And from the different types of proteins, you can then figure out how many different types of neurons you have in the brain of a species, right? So the expectation going in was that when people compared how many types of neurons you find in the cortex of a human to how many types of neurons you find in the cortex of a mouse, the expectation, the intuition was, well, humans are special, right? So there must be something about our cortex. Our cortex must, of course, have all these different types of neurons that you don't find in anybody else. Not true. You find pretty much the same few dozen types of neurons in humans as you find in mice. And of course, efforts right now are narrowing down to try to find something, anything, just any kind of neuron that is absolutely exclusive to the human brain. And I'd say you'd probably find something, which to me would simply speak to how more of something buys you diversity. When you have more neurons, you start having this division of labor that is a possibility that you didn't have before, right? And that's something that we see. We know that we see when we compare brains of different sizes. There are only, say, maybe 10 or 12 different types of parts in the cerebral cortex of a mouse or a rat that do 10 to 12 different things. And in a human cortex, you have about 200 of them. But it's not that they are completely new. They're subdivisions of what you find in a smaller brain, right? They're just breaking down the work that gets done. That work gets more intricate, more complex, more flexible, the more neurons you have. So that's where to come back to your question, that's where that's the logic that I find in all this, that the more neurons that you find in the cortex of a species, the more capable of making its behavior flexible and complex that species should be, which to me, that is my running working definition of intelligence. Is simply behavioral flexibility, and complexity is one of the results of flexibility. That you become capable of doing more and in more different ways. And then there's the added bonus on top of that, which is the most recent thing that I found that I've published. It's that there's, with more neurons in the cortex in evolution, comes a whole added dimension to life, which is more time. It turns out that, again, we were talking about how bodies are not really the significant variable that determines anything. For the longest time, body size was considered to be the main predictor of longevity. The bigger an animal is, the longer it lives, which to a certain extent works fairly well, but simply because that was the best variable that was available. But now that we have numbers of neurons in the cortex, it turns out that, so body variation in body size explains about 30% of the variation in longevity across warm-blooded species. Variation in numbers of neurons explains 74% of the variation. And here we're talking about the entire range of mammals, and actually birds as well. And nobody is an outlier. We're not outliers. Birds are not outliers. Warm-blooded species live as long as you would expect for the number of cortical neurons that they have. So here you have this added dimension also to add to the story of human evolution, which is, as our ancestors got more neurons in the cortex, that also came with a longer life. That also came with a longer childhood. So more time to learn, more time to develop those cognitive capabilities, right? And to learn to do things with those capabilities that you have. So you put all of that together, you give it 2 million years time, and especially give it about 10,000 years of recent time where we got past the Ice Age, we had the development of tools and all the technologies that you start getting from there. And we have this incredible body of culture that our species has built and passes on from generation to generation. And I think that's where we have to understand that if we want to really understand, grasp what modern humans are about, I think it's much, much more than just the biological aspect of what makes our body human, what makes our brain a human brain. There's all there are all these added levels and domains of how much time we've gained in lifetime, in individual lifetime, but also in compound numbers of hours that the species as a whole has had to build technologies and to put culture together. So we can no longer separate what it is like to be a modern human from all the history that we've put into using the brains that we have. That's an integral part of being human. We're way more than just our biology now.
So I've asked you earlier how our brains compare to the brains of other primates and mammals, etc. How do they compare to the brains of other hominins?
We, modern humans certainly have bigger brains than ancestral hominins. So if you could transport yourself back then, there was, of course, no way of telling what was ahead, right? There's no way of telling the future. Evolution, the story of evolution only works backwards. It's exactly the same as trying to understand what happens to the stock exchange. People have all these theories about, oh, oil prices went down today and that caused a change in the stock exchange. No, the best that you can say is those two things happened in the same day, and do that retrospectively. And sure, you can come up with what sounds like a reasonable story of cause and effect, right? But it's not predictive. You cannot say today what is going to happen to the stock exchange in not even in a month, much less in a year. So the story of evolution works exactly the same way. It's not a story of progress. It's not a story of improvement. It's simply a story of change. So our ancestors, or the hominins, looking back, we know now that they were our ancestors. They had smaller brains than we do today, so we can infer that they had fewer cortical neurons than we had today. And the interesting thing too is that now, with what we know, we can also infer how long they lived as children and what was the maximal life expectancy that they had. And we can actually put numbers to this. So we can infer now that 2 million years ago, our ancestors became sexually mature at age 8. And at most, they could live 60 years or so. And that's very different from what we can do today. So with more neurons, not only came more cognitive capabilities, but also 50% more time as infants and as children. That's protected time to count on your parents, to learn with your parents, to learn with your peers, right? And so, of course, once you compare what even human children can do to what mouse children can do, that's a highly unfair comparison, not only because we have 1,000 times the number of cortical neurons to do the processing, but also our children have 10 years or 12 years to learn to function in the world, where all the time that a mouse has is 2 months. How much can you really learn in 2 months? How much culture, how much knowledge, how much technology can you really develop if all that you have is not just 1,000th fraction of what we humans have as in numbers of cortical neurons, but also if all you have, all your life is ever going to last is all of 2 years. I love suggesting that people do the mental experiment of thinking what we could achieve as individuals or as a species if we had the same lifetime of a mouse. I mean, imagine your life is over after 2 years. You barely got on your feet and you barely started talking, right? So how could you possibly build anything? So even a mouse, how much can a mouse do in 2 years, even if it develops fairly quickly in 2 months? That's what they do. And the difference is, of course, enormous. But then again, this is where I like to point out, that's not to say that mice are any worse off than we are. They're doing fine, thank you. So you really cannot say that evolution, that or even that bigger brains are better at survival, that they're fitter, that they're anything other than simply capable of more flexibility and complexity. But that's all it is. It's two completely different ways of living your life. But maybe a mouse would tell you that, maybe they're joking to each other. Oh, those silly humans, they wait 15 years until they start reproducing. Oh, idiots, we can take over an entire house in just a couple of years by just reproducing fast, right? So it's just a different way of life, literally.
Mm-hmm. But are we special in any way in terms of our brains, our behavior, our behavioral flexibility, or any other thing from an evolutionary perspective?
Define special. So if special means out of the ordinary, unexpected, extraordinary, literally, I will say very emphatically no. We fall on the mark. We're just another primate species, time and time and time again. What does make us remarkable is that we do have, thanks to our evolutionary history, thanks to the inventions of our ancestors, and thanks to the thanks to the inventions of our ancestors, we are the animal species that could afford the largest number of cortical neurons. And with that largest number of cortical neurons came not only the really enormous capability of behavioral flexibility and behavioral complexity, so of creating things and creating tools and developing technologies and asking questions about our world, and even being able to grasp that there are questions to be asked to begin with, right? And then having the time to address those questions, and then to inform yourself, and then to seek answers and use those answers to ask further questions, and then have the time to pass that on to the next generation, because that's something else that comes with this slower life, that comes in turn with more neurons. We have not only more time as individuals to learn, we have more time as a society to transfer that knowledge, to transfer that culture from one generation to the next. That's what schools are about. It starts in families, it starts at home, but that's what education is all about. And that's something that we so easily lose track of, that you absolutely need formal schooling in modern human life these days, because that's the only way you can efficiently pack all that knowledge, all that information, systematize it in ways that can then be handed over to the next generation in a still fairly short amount of time compared to the amount that we've amassed, right? And then you start realizing things like, of course, no single person these days can understand everything. There isn't one single scholar, one single polymath anymore who understand all there is to know about life in the universe, as you had in ancient Greece, right? Not only that, it's going to take you decades to fully grasp, to fully comprehend this little part of what we've come to know. So yes, we need schools. Yes, we need diversity. We need people with different interests looking at different things. And there actually is this component of why what we gain with a large enough number of people who compose a school, who compose a university, who compose a city, who compose a country. You need that number to have enough diversity that everything gets captured and gets passed on to the next generation.
Mm-hmm. So just one last question, and going all the way back to Darwin's Descent of Man, we started a little bit talking a little bit about that, but what would you say in terms of our brains and neuroscience, what Darwin got right and what he got wrong back then?
I think Darwin definitely got right the part where we humans, we primates as a whole, we are quantitative variations of a pattern. He absolutely got right the part where all creatures that exist today are related to each other, just like everybody in a family is related to each other, and you can trace that ancestry back to a common exclusive ancestor. That was the founding idea, really, of all of our common understanding of evolution today and the story of life as a whole on this planet. So that was an absolutely fundamental insight. What he got completely wrong was, but I'll argue very understandably so, because he was working with what information he had, right, 150
Sure.
years ago. But what he got completely wrong is the part that where diversity arises through natural selection, or let me step back, the part that he got completely wrong was this idea that evolution is improvement over time, and specifically improvement by means of adaptation through natural selection. I think
Right.
what we have in life is something much kinder, much more accepting, which I like to call whatever works. So that's going to be the title of my next book, which is exactly on these topics and how evolution and how diversity is actually something that appears naturally and incessantly again and again and again, and you do not need to invoke any kind of special mechanism like Darwin felt that he had to do. He had to come up with this really convoluted explanation to account for how natural selection itself would make diversity appear because of the advantages that come with diversity. It's no advantage is necessary. Diversity appears, period, simply because that's how biology works. Biology is never 100% efficient nor 100% efficacious. So variation just happens. And once it happens, it's simply a question of, okay, this is different. Does it still work? If it still does, if it still functions, if it still breathes, then it's all good. And that, I think, is how you end up with two brains of the same size that do completely different things. And one animal that is this small and has a tiny small number of neurons and lives all of 1 year or 2 years, but it still gets by and does qualitatively all the same things that we do. It solves problems, it gets oriented, it favors its kin, it acts with the understanding that there's a future and you can prepare for it. It's just that we do that in spades in a much more elaborate way, but that's really all that is. And as long as it still works, it's all good.
And do you think that this knowledge would have some implications in terms of how we think about some social justice issues, like, for example, how we think about people from other races and other
Absolutely.
ethnicities?
Absolutely. That is the main reason why I want to get this book out now. I think the idea of natural selection, the idea of improvement through adaptation by means of natural selection, it certainly got a lot of biology moving. It helped a lot of studies, but at the cost of not only in the scientific realm, creating this expectation in people's minds that every single feature, everything that is there for a reason, which is nonsensical. But much, much worse than that is the social implications, which Darwin himself was very clearly aware of. It's just that he certainly realized that that was an explosive topic, and he tried to just put a lid on it and but of course it came out. Of course, people picked up on it, and that's where social Darwinism came from. It's this idea. It's what you get when you apply the ideas of improvement over time through survival of the fittest, through this process of competition and selection. And that's how you get this idea, all these ideas, these absolutely vile and, most importantly, absolutely untrue ideas that some peoples, some races, some cultures are better than the others. They're not. They're just different. They all work. That's how you explain all of us being here. It's all different forms of diversity, and all of them work. We did not get here by beating everybody else, by being better than everybody else. We got here simply because variations appear. That's a fact of life, literally. That's how biology works. And we all function under the same sun in different conditions, in different realities, with different interests, which to me is one of the most beautiful things. But we all function, and we're no better or worse than anybody else. We're not better or worse than other individuals. We humans are not better or worse than other species. We're just different.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's end on that positive note. And just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you on the internet?
Oh, absolutely. Well, Google knows a lot about me. So just type my name, Suzana Herculano-Houzel, and you're going to find there's a lot of videos in both English and Portuguese on YouTube. You can, you'll find my book, The Human Advantage. It's available on bookstores. You will find 2 TED Talks. The first one is about human evolution in particular, that's called What Makes Humans Special, and which, of course, the answer is we're not special. And then there's another TED Talk called Why Do We Really Have to Go to School, which covers some of what we've talked about here. And there's a couple of websites, and there's my lab website with all the papers are available there. But I think if people get interested and they'd like to hear more about this, I think the 2 TED Talks and the book will be very good places to start.
Okay, great. So I'll be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Herculano-Houzel, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure, Ricardo. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview. The show is brought to you by people like you, so consider doing it. Otherwise, and if you like the interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Pauline Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omer Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslo Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacilades Araújo, Ethan Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Belby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz. My producers is Arweb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Codreano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirvan Balachandran. And my executive producers, Michel Rzeski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.